Poetic beauty. It's deeper than you might think. I've heard before that poets and poetry work in search of beauty. There's a richness and a loveliness to the language of poetry, and poetry uses that language to draw us into experiences of beauty, whether that's beauty in the natural world, in human relationships, or in some other unexpected place. I'm not going to dispute that beauty is one of the primary aims of poetry, but I do think it's worth talking about what that really means, because the search for beauty is not an excuse for shallow writing. That is, readers of poetry are probably not going to be satisfied with a poem that just presents them with a snapshot of something pretty. They're in search of something deeper, something more meaningful. Unfortunately, though, the work of inexperienced poets often settles into the underwhelming realm of just being a pretty description. And that's not a condemnation. Everybody has to start somewhere. But if there is something you can do to level up your work and deepen the beauty of your poetry, you might as well do it. And today, we're going to talk about how you can. Teaching poetry is fun because it means reading a lot of poems that are mirror reflections of the season that the class takes place in. Teach in the fall, for example, and you're bound to see piles of poems that are all about how pretty the leaves are. And let me be the first to say that autumn leaves are pretty, but these pretty leaves poems don't offer much beyond the assertion that the leaves are pretty, and that just isn't quite poetry. Part of the problem is that just about anyone could get up and say that the leaves in autumn are pretty, so it's not a very compelling claim to make in the first place. But beyond that, there isn't much that a reader could do with that claim. Well, not beyond saying, yeah, they sure are. See, a merely pretty poem is like a knick-knack on the shelf of somebody else's grandmother. You can recognize that it looks nice, but you probably aren't going to care very much about it. Real beauty, though, tugs at something deeper, and we often speak of heartstrings, which, to be fair, is kind of a worn-out turn of phrase, but I think it can teach us something about what separates great poetry from pretty descriptions. Take, for example, a violin. Each string is tuned to play a particular note, and then, of course, you can put your finger down anywhere on any of those strings to play a different note. But when you play a violin, there are moments of magic that occur whenever you play a note that matches one of the open strings. That's because two strings playing the same note will vibrate sympathetically with one another. Play a D on one string, and those vibrations will get the D string going too. As a result, the D you play will get some lovely acoustic backup from its neighbor on the next string over. And now, if we can imagine one string as your poem and another as your reader, we can start to think more productively about what it is that good poetry actually accomplishes. It causes the heartstrings of your reader to resonate, to sing, in other words, a matching note. But that isn't going to happen if the poem plays the wrong note, or if the prettiness is just too shallow to get into the reader's heart in the first place. And I get it, all this heartstrings talk is maybe a little silly, but the concept of resonance is still a useful one. And in order to get that resonance, your poem needs to play a specific note. So the problem with a poem that only says the autumn leaves are pretty is that that's such a generic note to play that it isn't likely to get anyone's heartstrings resonating in tune. So our objective is to get our poems to resonate with things that are more meaningful than just a declaration of prettiness. We want to connect with something deeper and more human. We want our work to resonate with the experiences and emotions of our readers. Fine, it's one thing to say that a beautiful poem is a resonant poem, but that's about as abstract and useless a statement as we can get. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, I'm awfully glad you asked. Shakespeare's Sonnet 18 is famously focused on prettiness. It's a poem addressed to a beloved other who is more lovely and more temperate than a summer's day. The speaker of this sonnet speaks of rough winds shaking the darling buds of May and reflects on how the sun's gold complexion is often dimmed. These are all pretty descriptions of pretty things in nature, and they all work in service of praising the prettiness of another person. But the sonnet doesn't stop there. Shakespeare turns to discuss how the beloved person's beauty and life are eternal because they are immortalized in the lines of the sonnet. As long as the sonnet lives, the memory of the person will endure. And here we resonate with deep feelings of life, death, aging, and love. This poem doesn't just say, gosh, you're pretty. It says, gosh, you're pretty, and isn't writing an interesting way to outsmart death? You don't have to know exactly who Shakespeare was writing about to appreciate those themes of mortality and the transience of human relationships. So his turn towards those more resonant themes helped to carry the poem deeper into our hearts. But at the same time, if he had just said people get old and die, but writing is a way to preserve their memory, then we would probably still struggle to care. That wouldn't really be poetry either, it would be something more like a philosophical treatise in the length of a sentence. Really, it's the combination of the specific, beautiful imagery and the deeper, more resonant themes that make the poem sing. Or take Gerard Manley Hopkins' Pied Beauty. In this poem, we get an abundant heap of pretty descriptions of pretty things. Skies of couple color, rose moles all in stipple upon trout that swim, fresh fire coal, chestnut falls, finch's wings. But Hopkins doesn't just give us a little sprinkling of prettiness and call it a day. For Hopkins, all of this prettiness draws his heart towards worshipful feelings. He sees in them a generous and abundant creator, one whose beauty supersedes even the jaw-dropping beauty of the landscape. Even if you aren't an enthusiastic believer like Hopkins, you can probably still appreciate the human experience of contemplating the grandeur of the world and the forces that brought such beauty into being. We could even take a look at William Carlos Williams' infamous Red Wheelbarrow poem, which I've already talked about at length before, so we won't spend too much time on it now. But even though this poem is less explicit about the larger resonant themes that it addresses, it can still resonate. Like I said before, this poem transports me to a quiet and refreshing moment in the countryside. I don't really know why so much depends on that red wheelbarrow, but that retreat to a moment of peace away from the rush of the world is deeply resonant and compelling to me. This poem is decidedly more than just a pretty description. But again, that's not to say that the pretty description is entirely dispensable. It's still an essential part of poetry. None of these poems would work without those specific and lovely images to draw us in. And this might just be my inner rhetorician leaking out, but here's why we need both parts. The resonant insight makes a claim about the experience of being human that we care about and are moved by, while the specific observations and lovely imagery serve as evidence that engages our senses and validates the larger compelling claim made by the resonant insight. If Hopkins just told his readers to praise God, we could imagine them asking, well, why should we? And at the same time, if he just told them about those pretty things that he observed one day, we could also imagine his readers asking, so what? By doing both, by pairing a resonant theme with a pretty description, Hopkins gives his readers an understanding of why they should praise God and of why those pretty things ultimately matter. And that is why poetry must be more than just a pretty description. So it's one thing to say that a poem should do more than just be a pretty description, but how can you ensure that your work actually achieves it? First things first, I'd say don't hesitate to write that pretty description. It's an important foundation for your work. Get that specific, compelling, and lovely imagery on the page because it's fun for you and for your reader, but also because it will serve as evidence for the larger resonant claims that you'll eventually be making. And then ask yourself what it is about those images that drew you to them in the first place. Why do you care about them? What is it about those images that resonates with your heartstrings? For Shakespeare, it was a question of mortality. For Hopkins, it was a matter of worship and praise. But what about you? Why do you care about the autumn leaves or the spring flowers or the empty winter fields? Sure, they may be pretty or interesting, but what deeper beauty do they draw you towards? Are there larger themes you can draw out? Is there some context that connects these images to a shared experience? Or do these images serve as a metaphor for something else? Right now, I'm thinking of a memorable experience that I had with autumn leaves. Years ago, I was visiting a forest with a friend in the late fall. All the leaves had already fallen, so the forest floor was layered thick with dead, pinkish gray leaves. All day, I kept looking at the ground and thinking that it looked like it was covered in ground meat. Now that's not a very pretty description, but it is a distinctive one, and that's what poetry is made of. However, if I wrote a poem that only said that the leaves looked like ground meat, that wouldn't really be poetry. It would be something more like a personal anecdote about a weird observation. To get to the level of poetry then, I'd have to think about how that experience resonates with something a little bit more than, gee, those leaves sure looked weird. And in this case, I think the right move would be to zoom out and consider the larger context of the day. I was out with a friend visiting the forest a little too late in the season, but I was also contemplating a relationship that I had with somebody else that had lost its charm, a relationship that I knew was nearing its end. So imagine then a poem that was about going into the woods after the leaves had already fallen, and about staying in a relationship that had essentially run its course. In that way, my specific personal experience can still resonate with larger themes, and the cycling of the seasons can serve as a metaphor for the rise and fall of human relationships. If I were to write that poem, it wouldn't just say, those leaves sure looked weird. it would say, "Those leaves sure looked weird, and it really does feel weird to be in a relationship with somebody when you don't want to be anymore." And that, my friends, just might be a poem. So yes, poetry is pretty. It's famous for it, but it can't just be pretty. In the pursuit of beauty, poetry must reach for something deeper. It must resonate with something more meaningful. So our job as poets is not just to say pretty things in pretty ways. We also need to encourage our readers to care about what we have to say, to see themselves somehow in our experiences. And we can do that by asking ourselves why our observations matter to us, connecting to more resonant themes, and then presenting our observations with that insight to help our readers see their experience in new and more meaningful ways. And if you don't get it right away, that's okay. That's what practice and revision are for. As long as you know not to stop with mere prettiness, you'll be able to make good progress towards real, resonant beauty. So I hope that helps. If you have questions, feel free to ask them, or if there are other writing things that you'd like me to discuss, let me know. My goal is to be helpful to you. In the meantime, though, it sounds like I've got my own Autumn Leaves poem to write, so I'll get to it, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.